Today, on Here is the Horror.
It's alive. It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. Oh, in the name of God. Now I know what it feels like to be God. Oh.
Hello, and welcome to Here is the Horror, the home of all things horrifying. My name is Adam, and I'm co-hosting with my friend Daniel.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. You?
I've been better. I'm good, all right. It's just been a very busy week. I've been a lot of overtime and pretty hectic schedule with trying to get everything ready for the show this week. But we'll manage.
2020's like that.
Yeah. Speaking of, today's episode is probably the worst time for me to be so behind, because I feel like this is going to be a pretty important episode, since we're pretty much going to try to cover the entirety of horror cinema. Well, not just cinema, but really just horror as a whole through the entirety of the 20th century. Which, of course, means everything is going to have to be very fast, very broad, and please just keep in mind, everything that we're talking about, we want to talk about more, but it's going to be a struggle to cover everything. So just keep in mind, if you're listening, if it seems like we skim over everything too much, that everything we mention is something that will probably get its own episode at some point.
We're not ready for 5-hour episodes yet. Maybe one day.
I remember when we first started, I was humoring the idea still that we might keep them down to like 40 minutes. Not that I mind. I personally like the long podcasts.
I definitely went in with the mindset, 2.5 hours, we would, have enough back and forth to have, an hour to an hour and a half long episode worth of recordable dialogue, and the truth is that we ended up around 4 hours of audio recorded to barely hit 2 hours, around that mark.
Yeah, and I guess before this one gets too long, we should probably go ahead and get into it. If it's your first time listening, we normally start the show with just a bit of modern horror and news before we actually move into our main topic. So, getting into that, we're getting near the Halloween season, despite the emails at work telling me that it's Christmas season already. So because of that, you're starting to see things cropping up with all the different horror avenues having their Halloween and horror events. One of those is the Shudder Horror Streaming Network is doing its 61 Days of Horror, where it's just constantly coming out with new stuff all throughout September and October. I'm sure you've seen that. I know you are on Shudder also.
Oh, I'm completely fine with that as well.
I actually saw they have One Dark Night on there, so I might have to watch that if I can find the time.
One Dark Night is amazing. I love that movie.
But I did want to watch something new, so I did see the very first thing they got on there for the 61 Days of Horror was the 2019 Color Out of Space, based on the H.P. Lovecraft story.
Yes.
Which I desperately wanted to see when it came out in theaters last year, but unfortunately it was only showing in like one theater near me, and at times that did not really cooperate with my work schedule, and I could have made it work, but I recall you actually had unfavorable reviews of the film at the time.
It's worth watching. I would not hold it against anyone for holding it in higher esteem than I do. For what it is, it's great aesthetically, and the audio in it is amazing, but not one of my favorite horror films.
I don't know if I'd go so far as to say I loved it, but I definitely enjoyed it a whole lot. It had a pretty good bit of body horror in it, which is something I'm always really into, so the latter part of that film I really enjoyed, and even like the build-up all throughout it was really good. It kind of had vibes very similar to the Creep Show skit about the meteorite that lands and slowly has the vegetation that overgrows the farm that stars Stephen King, which I suppose that means that was probably based on the H.P. Lovecraft story to a degree.
Oh yeah, King has tons of homages to Lovecraft. He actually played Jordy Verrill in the Creep Show movie.
Mm-hmm. I've read a bit of Lovecraft, not nearly enough, but I haven't read Color Out of Space, so I was kind of wondering if the reason you didn't like it was that it steered too far from the original short story or not.
Well, no, because, I love From Beyond and Reanimator, and those are both very loose adaptations. My biggest issue with it is, for a film that's trying to, present itself so seriously, so many of the characters in the movie are so absurd or caricatures of what their real-life equivalent would be that it kind of detracts from a serious tone in a film.
Yeah, I guess that didn't really bother me. I hesitate to call it Lynchian, but I really enjoyed how out there all the characters are. Like the hippie character in The Wood, who's also an electrician with like cameras in the trees, and they've got the Wiccan daughter doing rituals and riding horses.
I hated Tommy Chong's hippie character in The Woods. It just was so out of place.
Yeah, I guess for anyone not familiar, this was a 2019 Spectrovision production. Like I said, based on the H.P. Lovecraft story of the same name. Stars Nicolas Cage, which I was a little worried about, because, Nick Cage is going to Nick Cage, but he was actually
subdued,
surprisingly tame in this movie, yeah. And until the end, when it makes sense for him to start caging it up.
Yeah, and that's the toss of the coin when you watch a Nicolas Cage movie. He's either going to be Nick Cage, or he's going to be Bees, not the Bees!
Ugh, yeah, definitely a better Nick Cage adaptation than The Wicker Man was. The film was directed by Richard Stanley, who I'm not really familiar with any of his other work, but I know he apparently said he plans on doing additional Lovecraft movies, starting with the Dunwich Horror next. Mm-hmm. I know you mentioned the sound for it being really good. I saw the soundtrack was by Colin Stetson, who also scored Hereditary, which I thought had a really good soundtrack. In this, I didn't notice the music as much, but when I did, I enjoyed it. A lot of the sound and the soundtrack had a sort of glitching or distorted or sort of like I'm not sure how to say, an interpolation or arpeggiating going on sort of in like the strings and stuff, and I liked that. It gave that sort of unhinging aspect that was trying to match up with the way reality was falling down around all the members of the family in it. And Colin Stetson also composed the soundtrack for Red Dead Redemption 2, and he's actually also, I'm not sure if you're familiar, Daniel, but he's going to be the composer for the 4-episode Uzumaki anime that's supposed to air on Adult Swim in 2021.
Yay! Not enough modern films have soundtracks by Goblin.
That would be a very different tone, I think. I'm not sure if Goblin... I don't know, actually I could see Goblin working with Uzumaki pretty good. Yeah, I guess we haven't really talked about the plot any, and I probably won't, just to keep it open for anybody that wants to watch it, but I suppose the most abridged summary I could give is that a meteorite comes down from space and lands on the farmland of a family that lives out in the sticks, and contaminates their water supply, which causes all sorts of things to start going weird with the plant life around them, their animals, and the family themselves. And the camera really likes focusing on water anytime they're taking a drink, just to keep reminding you that they shouldn't be doing that. It's sort of a no, don't open that door, don't go in the attic sensation from the audience every single time somebody's taking a drink of water. So yeah, it seems like your opinion towards it has mellowed a little bit, but I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm definitely looking forward to the next Lovecraft Richard Stanley movie if he does indeed do another one. I'm probably going to be going for a while the next time I get into anything modern, so do you have anything modern you want to get into first?
I finally watched The Babysitter. It's on Netflix. I was actually really surprised at how much I enjoyed the film. The reason it sat in my queue for so long is because other things kept bumping it out of the way because I wasn't expecting to like it very much. But
yeah, I think it's a film that my brother and sister put on for me, and I was not expecting much of anything when they put it on for me, but yeah, I loved that movie.
Once the ball starts rolling in that movie, it just doesn't stop. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The horror aspect, the comedy aspect, the characters were all done really well. They were all very distinct. I kind of liked that each character had some kind of really over-the-top attribute to them. Some of them were way more amusing than others, but
yeah, I can't remember the name, but like the jock or the alpha male of the crew, that the way he keeps like encouraging the kid to try to survive against everything they're putting him through, even as he's chasing him down.
Yeah, that's actually Stephen Amell's brother, Robert. I don't know if you ever watched any of the Arrow on the CW, but Stephen Amell, he plays Oliver and Green Arrow. But yeah, he was probably one of my favorite characters because I like how, especially his physical tics, if you will, in the film. Like every time something was happening, he was doing like these insane backflips. And one of the funniest lines in the movie, he takes his shirt off without going too much into it, he takes his shirt off fairly early, and one of the characters, not much further down the film, just comes out and asks him, "Why is your shirt off?" And that was probably one of the funniest lines in the movie to me. But I thought all the characters were really interesting. They were all done really well.
Oh yeah, I also really like how quite a number of times when somebody gets killed and the blood just keeps splattering on the one guy's face over and over, and he keeps freaking out, "It got in my mouth!"
Yeah, it was definitely. I'm definitely glad I finally watched it.
Yeah, it's a very comedic entourage of villains, and the movie had a really 80s vibe to it for me, in a good way. I mean, and I think maybe part of that is that vibe of it being like a kid versus all these adults that you had in stuff like The Goonies, The Gate, to a lesser degree, Lost Boys,
Monster Squad.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get that kind of 80s vibe without going in a direction where you actually set it in the 80s. There's things that are set in the 80s that manage to really capture that feeling well, but when you have something set in modern day and it is able to evoke all those things that really made 80s horror so great, I love that. And they did a great job with doing that with a movie in a modern setting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially I was really surprised how, I don't want to say emotional, but it felt like there was heart in the finale.
Oh yeah, definitely. Also, finally watched The Wretched. It's a 2019 horror film. It was pretty good. I wouldn't say that it lived up to the hype that I'd built for myself for the film. It was good.
So I'm not familiar with this movie at all. I mean, you said it was 2019, but what sort of style of horror is it?
It's about a witch, but it's a conglomeration of different lores around the witch. In this film, it's the witch as a supernatural creature that is beyond human in their abilities. It's not a traditional witch where it's
more the kind where a witch is almost like its own species.
Yes.
Okay, I like those.
I did too. There's some interesting things they do in the story. There's kind of a twist in it, but for me, the twist kind of falls flat because of the way the movie's set up. But it was definitely something I'm glad I've watched. It had enough interesting things in it that I'll probably watch it again. It won't be something I watch 2 or 3 times a year, but with the dry spell we've kind of had the movie industry in general, over the last 6 months and even going back into late last year. So it was nice to see something more recent that was really good.
So I know you said it had witches in it, but I mean, is it a more suspenseful, or is it gory, or is it
It's a very good mixture of the two, I'll say that much. It doesn't shy away from the gore or the kills. There's some really nice visuals in the film, especially I love the creature design, and it starts off kind of this mystery, but then the movie does a very good job of picking up speed as it goes, and then once you get out the gate, it's a full-blown race against time.
Okay, yeah, I might check that one out.
I also recently picked up the 2017 reprint of the 1982 Creepshow trade paperback. It's just a comic book adaptation of the film.
That's pretty interesting, is how it, there was all those EC horror comics, and then Creepshow got made as a movie parodying them, and then it itself turned into one of those comics.
Well, and it's really nice too because they tried to do a really nice homage with this, and they went with the same kind of art style and layout. It was a very interesting read.
So is this an omnibus, or?
No, it was. That's how it was initially released. It was done by an imprint of Simon & Schuster, and it was meant to be a tie-in to the 1982 film. It is just the film in comic book form.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Other than that, I've been playing CARRION lately. It's kind of a reverse horror game. In this one, you're playing as a monster, and you are basically a blob of biological material, and it's got stealth aspects to the game. You do a lot of creeping through vents to sneak up on people, to kind of catch people off guard. You're trying to escape from this facility where you've been studied, for lack of a better term. And as you capture and devour scientists and guards and stuff, you grow in mass, and that opens up different abilities. When you're small, you've got access to these abilities, and then as you get bigger, you get access to other abilities. It's cool because you can sneak around, you can set up all these really elaborate traps. And eventually you get to where
it's 2D, right?
Yes, it's a side scroller. There's really cool tricks you can do in the game. You can cut off power, and one of the things I really liked is there's what equates to a save checkpoint where your mass kind of seeps into the area in that room and grow over the entire area.
I love when my mass seeps into a room.
Yes. It's short, but it's a really fun game, and you can get it relatively cheap. Definitely worth playing if you just want to have a kind of quick, almost like fast-paced The Thing.
Yeah, that's kind of the vibe I was getting from the way you were describing it.
Yes, it does it very well, too.
Can you spawn random dog heads coming off of your blobous torso?
No, but you do eventually get the ability to remotely control people that you have infected. So you can use a guard that's got a gun to shoot other people.
It sounds... I mean, that's cool, but it seems very underwhelming compared to just being an all-consuming blob slowly filling the complex.
Oh, well, eventually, that's kind of your end goal, to grow and evolve and escape. But yeah, eventually you get to where you're taking up a more than your fair share of the screen.
Like a body horror Katamari Damacy.
Yes.
Sadly, I haven't really had time to play or read much anything horror. It's only been watching things, usually while in the midst of something else. I had noticed on our earlier episodes that we'd mostly been watching things on Shudder lately, so I had decided that I wanted to try to branch out from that a little bit, and I suppose Netflix or Amazon Prime would be the obvious place to go.
Or even Hulu. That's where I watched The Wretched on Hulu.
And I actually did line up a few things to watch on VOD, but I didn't get around to that. I kind of got distracted by seeing that there was a website that was going to be having a horror short film festival called BingeHorror. So seeing this, I went to investigate this BingeHorror site, and I'm not really sure what to say about it. I suppose you could call it a poor man's Shudder almost, but just say the average quality of the films on it seem to be two people get a video camera and decide to make a horror movie in their backyard and do very poor green screening. I just sort of went through... They had a list of things that were their most popular and also a list of things that were exclusive to them, and so I just found something that was on both of those and watched that to start with, which was just some short called The Nymph that was about a mermaid that was pretending to be human, but she kept having to periodically eat people, and it was sort of like... It almost felt like a Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode, because it had a very comedic tone, and she killed a guy, and then her mom, mermaid, showed up and had to call in a cleaner who was a man that used to be a satyr but had his horns filed off so he could pretend to be human, and then they put all the body parts of the guy she killed in blender and made a bunch of drinks for her to drink, and then police show up, and it was super short but pretty entertaining. It was, like I said, very amateur in pretty much every way. But I decided to find something more feature-length, so the next thing I saw on their list of most popular was something called Queen Dracula, and that was pretty rough. I'm going to try to go do a full run-through for this, because I think you'll enjoy it pretty good. So this, like I said, it's like a video camera in someone's backyard. It opens with a man in a trailer home, and he takes out a light bulb and replaces it with another. And then he runs into a girl that is clearly a vampire outside. She's wearing a black cape and is pale, and he informs her that he is a detective investigating child murders. Then she invites him inside for a drink. And then when the light bulb turns on, it turns out the bulb he changed out makes it radiate sunlight, so she falls on the floor while a fog machine bellows off of her. And then the man announces that he's Van Helsing, and he holds up his clearly dry hands and announces, "I dipped my hands in holy water," and then strangles her dead in about 2 seconds. And, it cuts to modern day, where it has some family whose wife had recently died, and some nonsensical plot about how the mother's will had guaranteed a dowry to whoever married the youngest daughter, so people keep showing up to marry her. It doesn't go anywhere, it's irrelevant. But then the dad gets a postcard telling him to come to a ghost town in Transylvania, and his daughters ask why he would go, but he insists, "An invitation to a ghost town, that's a story right there." And then proceeds to green screen drive to Transylvania, which didn't really seem to make sense since they seem to be clearly a very southern family, Southern America. But then he gets in Transylvania and everybody there has southern accents too, so I guess that's just how people in Transylvania talk. I could continue to go on with the plot for a while, but Queen Dracula makes him take off his wedding ring because it's a holy item, so it hurts her. She tries to hook up with him, but he refuses, but then eventually gives in because she reminds him that his daughters now need a stepmom. And then he gets home and announces that this is his new fiancée, so one of his daughters tries to strangle her, and then it cuts to that daughter's in an asylum in a straitjacket now because she tried to strangle the mom once, and she has a green screen prison cell as the background and keeps chatting with her cellmate who has the same green screen background, just reversed. And then the other daughter goes to work at like what looks like a Rite Aid, and Queen Dracula shows up there and announces that she's the regional manager, and then proceeds to tell her why she's garbage at her job while the chroma key makes her hair translucent. And then Van Helsing shows up to help the daughters kill the vampire and says they need a holy item to do it. So you think they'd just go get a cross, but instead they drive back to Transylvania to go search in the woods with flashlights to find the wedding ring. And then vampires attack them and they kill them with super soakers filled with holy water.
Zombies ate my neighbors.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of just Lost Boys again, and I could go on, but I mean, I think I've said enough about it.
But now you've made me really curious to go see it, so I'm definitely going to have to check that out.
Well, I'll share my login if you're curious. I will say something else about this binge horror service is I saw they have like the regular sub, which is like $2.99 a month or something like that, or you can sub yearly, or you can do the erotic horror sub for $8.99 a month, and they have a section specifically for that. So I was thinking maybe that's probably where they make most of their money, and it's probably all just porn with a slight horror vibe. But I did see something on there was on their most popular, so I went ahead and checked it out, and it wasn't that, but it did have a lot of full frontal in it. So that was Bigfoot Blood Trap, which advertised itself as a cryptozoologist tries to get girls to mate with a Bigfoot to create the missing link. So that I went into this thinking I was going to just confirm that this was a porno and that was going to be it, and it opened like that, but then the girls that were naked got killed by the Bigfoot almost right away. And then skipping over most of the plot, once the people finally have a Bigfoot back at the house, it actually became very entertaining. I was actually a little upset that this was actually the best shot and acted thing I'd seen on this service so far, but most of what carried this movie was the cryptozoologist mad scientist guy. He was constantly cracking jokes, and once he told everyone that he wanted to, instead of them taking the Bigfoot to the news, he thought they could make more money if they let him do scientific experiments with it. They start going, "What do you expect us to do, open a dating profile for Bigfoot?" And then he thinks that's a great idea, so then that's what they start doing. But then the mad scientist doesn't understand what it is at all, so they're constantly having to explain stuff about the internet to him. You know, stuff like, "Oh, we got a reply," and then he goes, "Can she hear us?" And they try to get girls, but the Bigfoot keeps killing them because they have tattoos and he doesn't like them. So they hit a snag, and they're like, "Oh, any girl we find on a dating site's going to definitely have tattoos. What do we do now?" "I know, we'll use a religious dating site." But then a Jehovah's Witness shows up, and they end up trying to get her to hook up with the Bigfoot. And anyway, I'm not going to keep going on about that, but I think I've covered decently what the quality of the stuff on this site was. I did eventually, after this, I just started scrolling through things rapid fire, trying to find if there was anything quality, and I did eventually find a short, like 15 minutes, called Thresher that was actually shot really professionally, acted really professionally, and was actually really good. It was written and directed by Alex Clark, whose current career seemed to mostly be as a set dresser for shows like The Boys and Titans, the DC show based on Teen Titans. The description for that one was, "A lone man is terrorized by a masked burglar one night, but the intruder realizes that the man's house is not what it seems." And I won't say any more about that one, but yeah, in that, the acting, the cinematography, the effects, fight choreography, they were all fabulous in that. So maybe there's other quality things on there, but you'd have to hunt for them a bit.
I will say that there is a merit to that type of content. Even in something like the vampire film you were talking about, you've got some really creative ideas in there. It may be something elevated above the rest of the production values and what have you, but I kind of like the idea of the wedding band as a holy relic, because from a religious standpoint, that's supposed to be representative of the bond, unbreakable bond made between a man or a woman and someone else and God. So even in something that's got maybe bad acting or low production values, you can get these little nuggets out of it that amount to something.
Oh yeah, I'd agree. I mean, the whole time I was watching that, and even the Bigfoot one, I kept thinking I could see in the writer's head how this was going to play out on the screen.
And it sounded entertaining enough, good or bad, that I definitely want to check it out now.
Yeah, that one was so bad it was good, sort of. Yeah, and that service, even though a lot of it's super amateur, I mean that does have an appeal. Just I would say if you're listening to this and thinking about subbing to that, just know that you'd mostly be subbing for that sort of backyard amateur my first horror film sort of vibe. If you're into that or the so bad it's good stuff, then by all means. But although obviously there is some good stuff on there too, like that Thresher short. But I did actually see another independent horror film this past week, which I'm really excited to talk to you about. I don't know if you've seen it or not. I'll be surprised if you haven't, but if you haven't, I'll be delighted to tell you about it. And that was Never Hike Alone by Womp Stomp Films. Are you familiar with this?
No, I'm not.
Okay, I'm so excited to tell you about this. I almost don't want to tell you about it. I almost want to stop this right now and just do a simultaneous Let's Watch of it, because I would be very delighted to watch to hear your reactions to it.
Oh yeah, that's fun. Let's do it.
Alright, and now you have seen Never Hike Alone.
Yes, I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, fantastic fan film. The first, since we haven't had a proper Friday the 13th movie in a decade, it's good to finally get what we wanted out of a fan film. That was done by Womp Stomp Films, released on October 13th, 2017, which was, of course, a Friday the 13th. Since then, they've also done a short, I hesitate to call it a music video, it is a vocal song with Jason doing some stuff over it, called Disappear. The prequel, Never Hike in the Snow, is coming out on October 13th, 2020. Almost a shame they decided to do it then. If it's the 3-year anniversary of when the original came out, but if they'd waited for November 13th, that would have been a Friday the 13th. But so apparently the person that makes these, Vincent DeSanti, who's the producer, director, and writer, and also played Jason Voorhees in it, he plans on doing this as like a full series, where after the prequel, Never Hike in the Snow, he's also going to do Never Hike Alone 2, Never Hike Again, which is, from the premise he's listed, seems like it's going to be more Tommy Jarvis focused. Yeah, so Tom Matthews was in Never Hike Alone, who played Tommy Jarvis in Part 6, Jason Lives, and Tom Matthews is confirmed to be in Never Hike in the Snow, the one coming out this year. But then after that, there's going to be Never Hike Alone 3, Jason Takes Crystal, which is, I think, about Tommy and Kyle MacLeod, the character from Never Hike Alone, in a hospital together that Jason attacks. And then it's going to conclude with Never Hike Alone 4, The Final Hike.
Yes. Conclude.
Yeah. The description's listed as, armed with the answer of how to finally destroy Jason, the survivors go to Crystal Lake to defeat him.
Definitely recommend it. 2 thumbs up.
And he's made some other things. I know he did something called Jason Rising with Red Crow Films that's currently in post-production. It's supposed to release in 2021. It got delayed due to COVID-19, making it difficult for them to do some of the more intensive shooting. But if you're not familiar with that one, Daniel, Jason Rising, that one looks even like more professional and better than this. They have trailers for it, and it has like stuff like the decapitated body of Jason's atrophied dead mom walking around and stuff. It looks really good. The person that made this, Vincent DeSanti, is also doing Dylan's New Nightmare, an Elm Street fan film, which that's currently in pre-production though. So yeah, a lot of really cool stuff coming out of these people.
Definitely something to look forward to.
That pretty much covers everything I've watched recently. Like I said, I haven't really had time to read or play anything horror-wise.
Yeah, it happens.
Alright, so I guess that wraps us up, and we'll get to the news next. Okay, so for news, I don't have much. The only thing I really have is kind of what pointed me towards that Friday the 13th fan film, which was that on October 13th this year, a Friday the 13th Deluxe Edition is coming out, released by Shout Factory.
Mm-hmm. It's going to be one of the biggest Friday the 13th sets we've ever had available. Got to believe it's a 16-disc Blu-ray set. They're going to have a standard and a collector's edition. You're going to get some extra stuff, I believe, with the collector's edition. You can pre-order it right now.
Yeah, I actually have pre-ordered it. So
I pre-ordered it the minute I saw that they were live. I'm really excited. We're going to get a lot of new and rarer deleted and extended scenes, like Alice's death from the second film. We're going to get some new interviews in the set, and we're actually going to get 4K transfers for the first 4 films, I believe.
Yeah, I believe that's right. Yeah, it's pretty much everything you could ever want out of any kind of set. Normally when you have these things, every time they do a collector's edition, it's different features than before, but this is sort of almost like every feature you could ever want from any version on it. And obviously it's 16 discs, which is way more than the number of movies you have, but it has like 2 discs of just bonus features, including like Man Behind the Mask music video and a whole bunch of brand new interviews. And it's got 2 versions of several of the movies. It's got, the theatrical version and the uncut version of the original version. As you said, it has the uncut stuff from part 2. And then I think it also has 2 versions of part 9, Jason Goes to Hell.
Mm-hmm.
And aside from that, it also, the part 3, it actually has the Blu-ray 3D version of the film, which I don't have a 3D TV, but I do have a PlayStation VR headset, so I might watch it on that.
This will actually be the 3rd Friday the 13th box set I've purchased. I got the really old one that was, I can't even remember anymore. The cases themselves were pretty plain, and they came in just a big cardboard slipcase. And there were some really nice special features and stuff on it. And then I bought one a few years ago that looks kind of like a book, and then you open it up and each page has the film disc in it, and there's some bonus feature stuff in there too, and like trivia about each of the films. But it did also come with Friday the 13th themed 3D glasses, so you could watch the old 3D version of Friday the 13th Part 3.
I don't think I've ever bought anything Friday the 13th before, actually, but yeah, this collection looked too... Basically, I saw it and was like, there's never going to be a better one than this, so I went ahead and pre-ordered that one.
Nope, not till we can download video straight into our arm.
Did you have any news yourself?
Yeah, NECA is making an action figure of Keith David's character Frank Armitage from They Live. I think that's the first real action figure we're going to have of his character, and it's coming from NECA, so it's just going to be a good figure. I'm kind of excited about that. I love They Live. The Chucky TV series has been pushed all the way to late 2021 because of the pandemic. It's affecting a lot of shows, a lot of movies right now.
Yeah.
Haunted Mansion, based on the Disney ride and the Disney movie.
Oh yeah.
We're getting an exploration type board game from Funko Games. They're coming out this year, and Hocus Pocus is getting from what I've seen on it, it appears to be a thwart the bad guy type board game. It's by Ravensburger. They're a pretty big board game company. They have a lot of really acclaimed board games.
So Hocus Pocus is getting a board game?
Yes, and the Haunted Mansion. From what I've read about it, the Sanderson sisters are trying to collect what they need to cast spells. The other players will be, unless it's an automated villain type game, like an AI type board game, the other players will be trying to thwart them from collecting all the ingredients they need for their spells.
So I know there was a sequel to Hocus Pocus that was supposed to be in development for Disney Plus. I don't think any kind of release date was announced or anything, but I wonder if that's meant to tie in with that.
Wouldn't surprise me. We just got the really nice... recently got the really nice Hocus Pocus Funko Pops. Not my thing, but there are plenty of people out there that love them, and if you're a Hocus Pocus fan, there's something you're definitely going to want to have. That about wraps up most of the news I've come across over the last week. I will say that if you follow Keith David on Twitter, or if you go to his Twitter, you can see a picture of him with the Frank Armitage action figure from They Live. He seems very excited as well.
Okay, that's cool. Does that wrap up our news section?
Yep, that's all I've got.
Alright, well in that case, not a whole lot this time, but that's probably good, because I think our main topic is going to take up a lot of this episode, so let's go ahead and we'll move on to discussing the entirety of the progression of the horror genre throughout the 20th century. So we're at the turn of the century at right around 1900, just to set the stage for where we're sitting in the horror landscape around this time. Bram Stoker's Dracula, the novel, was just published 3 years ago. H.G. Wells had just recently written The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, and War of the Worlds, all published in between 1896 and 1898. The Grand Guignol Theatre in Paris had just recently come around, showing gory on-stage kills with blood splatters on the audience. W. W. Jacobs' The Monkey's Paw was just published in 1902. We just had the first projected movie in 1895. Around this time, the German Confederation had finally completed its shift into a modern nation-state, which is going to be relevant because they're struggling to get a cultural identity, which gives rise to the German Expressionism movement, which is going to influence a lot of films that start coming around in the 1920s. So I think starting here, obviously, the cinema is just starting, so at this point people don't even really know what they're doing with theater. Horror is, of course, still alive in literature and theater plays, but you're starting to see the very first bits of it from the very beginning of cinema. I think what most people consider to be the first horror movie is 1896's House of the Devil or Manor of the Devil, which has somebody going into a haunted castle and just being tormented by various spirits and apparitions. Around that same time you have some other things like a sort of comedy horror called A Terrible Night, in which somebody's trying to go to bed but a giant spider assaults them and they have to fight it with a broom. Things like Nightmare, which is just somebody trying to shave after drinking something strange, and they just keep seeing a bunch of strange apparitions in the mirror. A lot of these were made by George Méliès, who was into prestidigitation. They were sort of a street musician, and so a lot of these early horror movies, it's not even proper to really call them horror. It's more like people were just experimenting with what you can do with this new medium of film. And so, of course, people like street magicians who are already into the idea of tricking you on what you're seeing are creating these sort of interesting films. Another example is like in 1897 you had The X-Ray Fiend, which the X-ray had just been invented. So this is just a film just focusing on showing actual X-rays of people as they're moving around. And you had 1898's The Cave of the Demons, which was the first thing to use multiple exposure to composite multiple shots together. But at this time, in the real world, things like circus, traveling stage musicians, this is really their time to shine before, electronic entertainment had really taken everything over. So people that had come from that sort of like sideshow business that could do parlor tricks, the sort of films that they could make in this burgeoning industry was this sort of stuff that would lead to her horror, but at this point it's really just more like fantastical rather than really horror.
And you're going to have tons of short films around this period because it's new and everybody wants to have their moment in the sun.
Yeah, and that was normal because before this, you had other forms of, I don't want to say film, but of moving pictures before the projected film came around.
Like the old Nickelodeons.
Yeah, exactly. Or things where you'd like just put in a coin and put your eyes up to it and just watch these short little clips. The short film was the norm at this point.
Yes, it would be a very long time from now before people could comfortably sit in a theater for 2+ hours to watch a movie.
Yeah, I think the first dramatic length film was The Story of the Kelly Gang in 1906, but it'd be a while before horror really got there.
We have the first Italian full-length feature film was L'Inferno in 1910. It's a loose retelling of Inferno from the Divine Comedy, so there's a lot of fantastical and horrific scenes displayed in that film. It's probably the earliest example of a full-length film that you could realistically call horror for what it was at the time.
Mm-hmm. Not long after that, we hit The Great War, which would later be called World War I, which probably stalled things out a bit, but once that wrapped up in 1918, the following year we get the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It seems like there's some debate about whether it was 1919 or 1920. It seems like it was filmed at the end of 1919 but released in 1920. And of course, at this time, German Expressionism was in full swing, so you get a lot of really strange, almost trippy, dreamlike elements in this, a lot of strange angles and architecture, and people commonly talk about the painted shadows, which I hear was actually as much of a design thing as it was a budget thing, because since this was a German film and Germany was having economic problems from the results of the Great War, there was mandates on how much electricity you were allowed to use, and so they chose to paint on the shadows to save on budget.
And you're going to see a lot of things in this film that would have a heavy impact going forth. And even today, a lot of the imagery and a lot of the situations in that film are still terrifying.
Following that, the next best known thing is probably the 1922 film Nosferatu, which also has that German expressionist vibe to it, which of course was basically just an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula for the most part. Has that same vibe with the vampire coming in through the window, going up to the girl in the bed, but they just changed the names of the characters to avoid the copyright.
Count Orlok.
Yeah, although they did get sued, and actually the majority of copies ended up getting destroyed, and for a long time it was considered a lost film until some collector revealed that they actually had a copy stowed away.
And that's apparently also the reason for the rat-like incisor fangs that they gave Count Orlok. It was to make him distinct from the source material.
Yeah, and I should say there was, of course, in this area of short films, there was a lot more things that could qualify as horror movies, like things that were based on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There was a movie called The Werewolf, but most of these films from this period are lost. Probably the next big thing I'd say from the 1920s would be The Cat and the Canary, which is an adaptation of a black comedy play that was also directed by a German expressionist, Paul Lini. Even though that one was sort of a parody of gothic horror, it was really influential in the development of that old dark house genre of films that would become pretty popular and continue to be throughout the 1950s. But of course, I'm pretty sure when anybody thinks of early horror cinema and where it began, most people would think of the Universal horror. And the earliest place you could probably say that started would be with 1923, where they did a adaptation of The Hunchback of Notre Dame and had Lon Chaney performing as Quasimodo. And of course, Lon Chaney would go on to be the Phantom in 1925's The Phantom of the Opera, which I think is probably the earliest really iconic horror film to most people, other than The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And outside of film, though, other things were happening with horror still. 1923, the same year as Universal's Hunchback of Notre Dame came out, that's when proper horror magazines really started to appear, like Weird Tales, which H.P. Lovecraft would write for. In this period, in the 1920s, of course, that's when most of his work was written. And although it's not super relevant to horror at this point, the 1920s is also when we get the birth of commercial radio broadcasting, which would become relevant in a couple decades. And so as you roll around from the 1920s, Hollywood at that time was actually full of a ton of scandals, and the film industry was starting to get a really bad reputation. To counter this, most of the states in the U.S. were passing their own movie censorship bills, which was creating problems for the film studios since they had different standards in every state. So it was around this time that the studio started deciding that they needed to self-regulate, which is where you get the Hays Codes from, which was adopted in 1930 and would control the standards of what you could expect to see in movies for the next couple decades. Of course, also once we roll around to the 1930s, that's when we start getting the talkies, and we finally start moving out of the silent age and into the age where we actually have audio in our films.
And moving into the 1930s, we're going to start to see what many people would consider the first real era of horror films, the modern horror film. The Universal Studios is going to start their bevy of films and release them. We're going to see a return to a lot of gothic themes in this time period, a lot of the gothic aesthetics. We're going to see a lot of science versus religion thematically in films. That's going to be a big point in a lot of the movies we'll see over the next decade or two. Also, our first glimpse of a zombie film, though this is going to be the more traditional zombie until decades later. I think it really kicks off in 1931 because that's where you're going to have your first two major Universal monsters. You're going to have Dracula and Frankenstein, which are going to establish Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff as names in horror films, and they're both going to have very prolific careers in the genre pretty much for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I mean, we could have an episode about just either one of those individuals. We could have an episode about individually any one of those films. We'll have to save that for a later time, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, because they're going to set the standard for the next 3 decades. 1932, Universal's going to release The Mummy. We're also going to get White Zombie. 1933, we're going to get The Invisible Man from Universal.
And not nearly as relevant, but in 1932 we also had Dr. X, which is probably only really relevant for being the first color horror film, but the titular Dr. X was played by Lionel Atwell, who'd go on to continue having a supporting role in the majority of the Universal horror films.
Oh, yeah. And these movies, a horror film, are going to kind of see a boom throughout the 30s. As you move further towards the end of the 30s, horror films are going to kind of start to level out. They're not going to be new and shocking. So your Universal movies, you're going to see them start to kind of lose a little bit of steam. But then in 1939, you're going to get The Son of Frankenstein, which is going to completely reinvigorate the interest in the Universal monster style of movies.
And before we get into the 1940s, something else probably of note is in 1938 is when Orson Welles created the Mercury Theater on the Air, which was originally titled The First Person Singular. Their first episode was a live radio adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but they'd go on to over the radio broadcast a good number of other stage and novel adaptations throughout 1938. And of course the most well-known one is the October 30th presentation based on H.G. Wells' novel The War of the Worlds, which was presented as regular radio programming being interrupted occasionally by news reports about Martians invading, until eventually they release poison gas that kills the announcer. And after he falls silent, a ham radio operator cuts in asking, "Is anybody out there?" And then after the break, they cut to it being a regular drama for the rest of the presentation. But, of course, pretty famously, that caused a bit of an uproar with a bunch of people calling into the stations, inquiring about it. And whenever people told them it was just a show, nothing was going on, they got accused of covering up the truth and things like that.
I think it's kind of poignant here too. You know, that was one of our first urban legends as a society, because even now people aren't really sure how exaggerated the tales of what happened during this time. Because I remember as a child in school, we were taught, there was all this mayhem. People really thought the world was ending, and I'm sure that's true, but even now we don't know how severe it was.
Yes, it seems to be described normally that it was a big deal, but only in very small areas. And I think one of the people from the time described it as a tempest in a teacup. The loud minority and the silent majority type scenario. But then, as you roll around to the 1940s, World War II kicked in. Around that time, you had enough monster movies going along that they started to really lose their steam, and you start to get all the monster movies replaced by parodies, where you're starting to get stuff like Abbott and Costello hanging out with Dracula and the Werewolf, and Bela Lugosi going back into being on stage plays, and it starts getting replaced with a different style of horror.
Oh yeah, you're going to have tons and tons of sequels. You're going to have all of your team-up films. You're pretty much getting a new movie a month at this point. It's just like a mainstream explosion. Everybody wants them. They're making money.
Yeah, around this time you really get your first example of what had happened in literature before, but I feel like it's a lot easier to see in cinema, which is what some people call the horror cycle, where you have a subgenre appears, gets really popular, starts having tons of sequels and imitators, then the market gets so oversaturated that it falls into parody and then decline and then gets replaced. You kind of had that same thing with gothic horror before, and then with the medical dramas you had in the 1800s and the street thrillers, but here we have that with the monster phase of horror movies.
And in 1941, you're going to have Universal's The Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr. Out of everything that was released in the 40s, I think that's probably the most poignant film. Like I said, we're going to have a lot of your team-ups, a lot of your monsters meeting each other for the first time, almost like a Promethean MCU. And as you said, we're going to start having things like Abbott and Costello. They're going to be meeting monsters. You're going to start to see more of a silly tone in some of the horror movies. Yeah,
and kind of just like in the 1800s, how gothic horror got replaced by the more serialized real-world crime drama thriller. Something similar sort of happens in the 40s, where you start seeing a lot more down-to-earth suspense thrillers. You do have in 1942, though, Cat People by Val Lewton, really low budget movie he was doing for RKO, which of course since he had a low budget, that meant instead of having fancy effects or monsters or anything like that, they had to do all their scares instead with hinting at things rather than showing them. So it's all about using the shadows and the sounds and suspense. That's of course very famous for the what's called the Lewton bust now, where he had basically an early jump scare where it just builds up tension, and then you just hear the brakes of a bus suddenly to get a jump out of you.
And as you move through the 40s, monsters are going to quit being scary to people. The films aren't going to be scary anymore.
Mm-hmm.
and that plays into them becoming the foils for comedic talent, almost like a precursor to Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, much like we'll see happen later with slasher movies in the 80s. Once you've seen so many Dracula movies and you're sold so much Dracula merchandise, Dracula stops being a monster. He's a household family figure, and now you're eating a bowl of cereal with him on the box.
Yeah, and by the time the 40s are coming to a close, you see your first really big drought in horror films since they started. There's been times where they looked for some kind of boost to get people back into seats, but the idea of a horror movie gets really skewed throughout the 40s.
And as we'll see happening throughout time, really, as horror kind of comes and goes in waves in public popularity. Once horror starts fading out of cinemas, it just settles down into other avenues. So throughout the 40s, that's when you get a ton of the radio dramas that are centered around it, like Suspense, The Mysterious Traveler, The Whistler, Inner Sanctum Mystery, The Sealed Book, The Strange Doctor Weird. And most of those radio dramas didn't live past the 40s, but some of them would make it all the way up into the 60s. And a lot of these, since they were radio dramas, they had host characters like The Mysterious Travelers, hosted by the titular Mysterious Traveler, same with The Whistler. Or you had Suspense hosted by the Man in Black. And you'll sort of see that transition over into comics in the future when you have things like The Crypt Keeper Has to Tell Tales of the Crypt. And actually, though it'll be a while before we get those comics, in the 1940s you do start getting your very first horror comics. 1947 had Eerie Comics #1 by Avon, which was just a one-shot, but it was a standalone horror comic. And the following year, The Mysterious Traveler would have its own Tales of the Mysterious Traveler #1 by Transworld Publications. Probably the thing that's most important for helping horror movies start to become a big thing again is at the end of the 40s, you had the United States versus Paramount Pictures case, which was an antitrust case that ruled that film studios couldn't own their own theaters anymore. Because up until this time, production studios and the theaters were one and the same. It's very similar to how, like, in modern days, Sony owns the PlayStation Game Store, Microsoft owns the Xbox Game Store. Up until then, Paramount owned Paramount Theaters, where they showed Paramount Pictures, and you had to work with them if you wanted their movies. But the 1948 ruling caused a whole bunch of changes in the industry, which caused a rise in the number of independent theaters, a rise in the number of independent studios. It basically caused the beginning of the end for the golden age of Hollywood and would lead to an eventual weakening of the Hays Code. Very interestingly, on August 7th, 2020, this year, the U.S. Department of Justice finally started a 2-year sunsetting of those antitrust decrees, stating, quote, "It is unlikely that the remaining defendants can reinstate their cartel." So, come 2030, I don't know, we might start having independent theaters owned by independent film studios again. If theaters are something that can gain ground again in the internet age.
If Disney keeps charging $30 to watch a movie, the theaters may not bounce back.
As we move into the 1950s, something else that's really going to change the landscape for film is that's when the TV begins to gradually replace the radio as the main entertainment of the home. And seeing how cinema had gone, television launched right away with a more restrictive censorship code than cinema had. And now that you can watch video in the home, the theaters needed something to compete. So, since the TV had more restrictive codes, it started incentivizing cinemas to show what was considered more risque content that the TV censors wouldn't allow. And there was a lot of other factors that were encouraging cinema at this time to become more risque and shocking. Foreign films were finally starting to become a really large industry, and they weren't restricted by the Hays Code. So you had all these other films coming out that could do more than American films could. And it was around the same time that in the UK, the X certificate gets issued for 16-plus graphic films. And it had been ruled in 1915 that films didn't have the right to free speech, but because of some of these factors, it was overruled by the Supreme Court in 1952, which also severely weakened the ability to regulate U.S. films, and so that would cause a big period of what you could see in films in the late 50s and early 60s really getting more shocking.
And as we move in here, too, you're going to start seeing the era, as you were speaking to, where these monsters that just a few decades ago were legitimately scary, you're now going to see Junior getting magazines in the mail that features them. You're going to see children that are going to go to sleep with pictures of these monsters hung up on their wall. They enjoy them, they absorb them, but it's not about horror anymore. They have fan clubs, and that change over the 50s. You're going to see the birth of the teen horror film, the beginnings in film of the careers of Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing. These are all people that are going to become significant, iconic figureheads in horror. But it wouldn't be till the later end of the 50s till you really get to see horror movies become horror movies again.
Yeah, I think especially in the early 50s, that's really where you get the atomic age stuff really kicking in. I know there's a lot of arguing about how much sci-fi and horror really have to do with each other, but around this time they're really intertwined.
And you're going to start to see a lot of real-world happenings get portrayed on the screen in these fantastic scenarios, but they're rooted in very real fears of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, 1950 is when you get the Hulk, which of course is a result of radiation poisoning, but more importantly, in 1953, you get The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, has a stop motion by Ray Harryhausen, and that's of course is about a dinosaur that gets woken up by an atomic bomb and starts rampaging through the city, which of course would be done again in 1954 with Godzilla. But you have a whole bunch of this radiation and science stuff. Everything's very tech in this period. You get stuff like the 1956 film The Incredible Shrinking Man, 1958's film adaptation of The Fly, and you get TV shows like Tales of Tomorrow and the science fiction theater in the later 1950s. And like I said earlier, the UK has that new X certificate, so this is where you start to really get Hammer horror. In 1954, trying to capitalize on that new X rating to get attention, they came out with The Quartermass Experiment. That was actually considered a really shocking film at the time. They had to earn that rating. And of course, what that film shows is tame by today's standards. You know, a man who's been exposed to some experiment and his arms morphing and he's turning into a monster, but the success of the Quartermass Experiment was way bigger than Hammer was expecting, and so that leads them down into the more horror direction where you sort of see the gothic horror revival that would become Hammer horror's bread and butter, with most of those written by Jimmy Sangster.
So that brings us to 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein. It was what is considered Hammer horror's first true horror film, and it's where they start taking these films that have been released, they're taking these stories, these characters, these settings, and they're really amping up the violence, the aesthetic, how monstrous the characters are portrayed. So with The Curse of Frankenstein, you're seeing this story that by now has been told many times. There's sequels, but you're seeing it in a new light, and you're seeing it as a truly scary film for the first time.
Also of major importance is this around the time that it starts becoming a lot more common for you to have color in film, and so for the first time you're getting blood that's actually like red blood splattering, and
yeah, as opposed to chocolate syrup used in the Universal films, which was used sparingly. In the Hammer films, that's another thing. You're going to see a lot more of the result of what these monsters do. You're not going to see just one little drip and then a cutaway. 1957 would also give us I Was a Teenage Werewolf. That's really important in the teen horror genre of the time, as it were. In the 50s, you'll start to see a lot of movies that are marketed to teenagers, and they do this by taking these teenage characters and putting them in horrific situations, like I Was a Teenage Werewolf. But once the Curse of Frankenstein was released, Hammer really started to hit their stride. It would be only a year later when we got The Horror of Dracula. That's what it was called in the U.S. It was just Dracula everywhere else. With Dracula and Horror of Dracula, that would actually be the first time you had a major mainstream film that would actually show vampires with their fangs. There were a couple of other, but they either weren't released in the U.S. at the time. And then you have Nosferatu, but he has rat teeth, so that doesn't count. And 1958, we also got The Blob, which now the concept of something like The Blob is ridiculous. But at the time, that was a newer concept. This alien being that is just rolling around, eating everything it can get its slime on.
Yeah, it kind of ties into that whole more sci-fi slant horror had during the 50s.
And then in 1959, we have, of course, from Ed Wood, Plan 9 from Outer Space. Probably one of the most notoriously bad B-movies ever made, but people still talk about it today, so take that with what you will.
In the mid-50s is also when Alfred Hitchcock Presents starts airing, which is going to be a anthology TV show that sort of predates what would come in later in the 1960s with the Twilight Zone TV series.
And as we moved into the 1960s, you would really see Hammer horror become a fixture. It's what they became known for. They cemented themselves at the time as pretty much the masters of horror films.
Yeah, it's pretty much the second wave of what was the Universal monsters, cementing what was 1930s horror, and then you have Hammer coming around and cementing what's horror for their era. And I know we've been very focused on the US and the UK, and there's pretty good reason for that, but in some other countries like Italy, they'd been largely prohibited from doing horror movies, but that finally started changing at the end of the 1950s. So in 1957, you had Italy's first horror film of the sound era, finally, I Vampiri, directed by Riccardo Freda, but he left the cinematographer Mario Bava to take over, and Mario Bava would go on to be really essential in the early Italian horror. They'd shortly afterwards do the 1960 Black Sunday, also known as The Mask of Satan, which is pretty famous for being unusually gruesome, with its big opening scene of them having a witch tied to a stake and branding her on the back and then hammering a mask full of spikes onto her face. But that's sort of what really started off what we'll see in the 60s as the way more shocking, way more gruesome Italian horror genres. And Black Sunday was shown as a double feature with Little Shop of Horrors by Roger Corman, who would become a really big name in his own right, doing a whole bunch of independent horror, a lot of creature features, until he was later on brought in to do what became known as his Poe cycle. And that started with Roger Corman doing The House of Usher in 1960 with Vincent Price, who would go on to become a big face of horror for the 60s.
You also had The Pit and the Pendulum in 1961.
Yeah, and then something else really interesting you have around this point is 1963's The Haunting by Robert Wise. It's just another old dark house, haunted house movie, but what's really important about this is that it's one of the first examples in a long while of really high-profile horror. Like I said, it was directed by Robert Wise, who, if you're not familiar, he'd won awards for film editing Citizen Kane, and he did earlier movies like The Body Snatcher and The Day the Earth Stood Still, but when he did The Haunting, he did that in between West Side Story and The Sound of Music. So this is an early example of a really high-profile director going ahead and doing a bit of horror. Like I said earlier about the Italian horror really kicking off at this point, something interesting to get here is 1963's Black Sabbath, which is an early attempt at a horror anthology film done by Mario Bava, who I mentioned earlier. That anthology has Boris Karloff doing the introductions for it. But after this, you would see tons of anthology horror from Amicus Productions, who would do Dr. Terror's House of Horrors in 65, 1967's The Torture Garden, and they would continue doing those up through the 70s with the 1972 Tales from the Crypt and 1974 From Beyond the Grave. Same time, Mario Bava directed The Girl Who Knew Too Much, which is usually considered to be the first giallo film, which is giallo meaning yellow, referring to paperbacks that were really popular at that time that were sort of like these detective noir suspense thrillers, and you'd see a ton of these giallo films in Italy at this time. 1964's Blood and Black Lace performed poorly, but is considered to have set a lot of the tropes, and then you'd really see a lot of Lucio Fulci and Dario Argento doing a ton of work in this genre, like Dario Argento's The Bird with the Crystal Plumage in 1970 would really cause that genre to explode when we get to that later.
So in 1960, right from the jump, you're going to have Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which is going to set an entirely new standard for what can happen in a movie, what can be shown on the screen. It's going to completely upset film at this time.
It had a toilet.
True.
Which were not allowed to be shown on film at that time.
You had a woman showering, which in this day, that scene comes off as very tame, but at the time, that wasn't something very common. That was not something you saw. And the tone of the film and the content it went over was a little bit darker than what we had seen at this point.
And now you had some visceral blood splatter in film and things like Psycho and Hammer horror. You start really getting into a phase where people start trying to push that envelope, because of course once you've been shocking once and it's been successful, what you want to do is push that envelope. So here you really get what's called the splatter film genre rolling from Herschel Gordon Lewis, from his mid-60s films that fans would later call the Blood Trilogy, like Blood Feast, about a man who kills women and uses their body part to make meals, 2000 Maniacs, about a bunch of people, including a then Playboy playmate, going into a southern town and getting tortured, quartered, dismembered, and barbecued, and Color Me Red, which is about a painter who murders people to use their blood as paint. And around this time, the production code, or Hays Code, had become so unenforceable that in 1968 it was completely abandoned, and the modern MPAA film rating system went into effect. Of course, ratings were different at that time. They had G for general audiences, M for mature, which at that time just meant no children under 12, R for no children under 16, and X for 18 or older.
Ooh, that did not work out for them in the long run.
We had quite a few revisions to that over time.
1962, we'd get Carnival of Souls, which has now become a cult classic.
Yeah, I love that movie.
A lot of the visuals in that film are going to inspire other films to come. They're going to be very important before the end of the 60s, actually.
Yeah, very dreamy and psychological visuals that kind of bleed into things later, like Suspiria.
And then 1964, we would have Quiden, which would be the first film to kind of capture what today would be considered J-horror. The next really big point for me would come in 1968. We'd get two very important films in that year. We would get Rosemary's Baby. We had films about witchcraft, voodoo, what have you, but this would be one of the first movies where we really got to see a movie about, in this case, Satanism in a realistic, grounded style.
Mm-hmm. And notably, that's probably the next, after The Haunting, the next really big budget horror movie, written and directed by Roman Polanski.
And that has a lot to do with it. You also get one of my personal favorite films of all time, and it's Night of the Living Dead by George Romero. It is the birth of what we now know as a zombie. The magic aspect is entirely gone. Now there are these ghoulish cannibals almost, and not only is this going to set the tone for the modern zombie, it's also going to inspire a couple of phases in Italian film, particularly throughout the next decade.
Yeah, like you said, the voodoo element from earlier stuff like White Zombie's gone, and now we have people on television in it theorizing about if it's from radiation or disease or satellite transmissions. And around this time we start moving into the 1970s, so that's when you finally start seeing Hammer going on decline here. They're getting a lot more formulaic, including a lot more nudity to try to bring in the views. I think the really big thing for the 70s, at least the early 70s, is starting off from Rosemary's Baby, causes this big trend of occult horror and folk horror. You get satanic-oriented things like The Exorcist in 1973 or The Omen in 1976. But you also have those very witchcraft-oriented things like Witchfinder General in 1968, The Blood on Satan's Claws in 1971, and The Wicker Man in 1973.
You're also going to get a lot of films with really dark exploratory tones in the 70s. You're going to see the birth of the exploitation film. Italian horror is going to come into an apex. You're going to have a couple of crazes that go on in Italian horror at this time. We're going to see the birth of the slasher. Mm-hmm. Your grounded creature features are going to play a big part in the 70s. Creature features, for example, you're going to move away from like fantastical creatures, stuff like the Blob, and you're going to start seeing almost a resurgence of the atomic film. You're going to see man interfering with nature in a way, and it's going to spur on these common docile animals are going to be called into action. We're going to see the rise of people like Dario Argento, Lucio Fulci in the 70s. In 1970, we'd get Dunwich Horror, which would be one of the first mainstream true Lovecraft adaptations. 1971, you're going to have Tombs of the Blind Dead. That's going to be probably the second really big zombie film since Night of the Living Dead. 1972, you're going to see Last House on the Left, which is going to be important for Wes Craven. That's also going to be a big exploitation film. It's going to kind of push the envelope a little bit more. You're going to have Night Stalker, which would eventually give us Kolchak the Night Stalker, the television show. That's hit or miss for a lot of people. I really enjoy it. We're going to have Tales from the Crypt. 1973, we're going to have The Exorcist, which is held by many as one of the scariest films ever made, one of the best horror films ever made. 1974, we're going to have Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which even by today's standards, there are plenty of things about that film that are completely unnerving. That's going to kick off your trend of based on a true story. 1975, we're probably going to have one of the most notorious nature versus man films, Jaws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they kicked off a resurgence in the creature features.
And for many different reasons, Jaws it isn't just a great horror film. It's a great film overall. It's going to be a really big deal for Spielberg. 1976, continuing from what I said about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we're going to have The Town That Dreaded Sundown. It's following on the based on a true story. 1977, we would have Eraserhead and Suspiria.
Alright, well, I'll just jump in and say we also had in 1975 Shivers by David Cronenberg, which was some really intense early body horror stuff. And also in 1976 you have the first Stephen King adaptation to film, Carrie, which sort of continues from that occult phase of horror that we have going in the 70s. Something else you had in the 70s going on, though, in the Italian horror scene was the cannibal craze, which kind of really started with the Mondo film or shockumentary, starting with Mondo Cane in 1962, which isn't a horror movie, it's just sort of a collection of shocking live footage of areas, places around the world. But that genre continued to progress and trying to become more and more shocking until you get to stuff like 1972's The Man from Deep River, which really kicked off the cannibal exploitation of film genre. It was directed by Umberto Lenzi, and that just kept escalating until you get to like 1978, The Faces of Death, which is largely just a movie just showing you a whole bunch of human corpses, and they just kept pushing the envelope more and more until you get to 1980 with Cannibal Holocaust, which, famously was believed to be an actual snuff film, and the people that made it were arrested, and as you said in our last episode, had to call in a bunch of the actors to prove that they were alive and show off to the court how they did the special effects to convince people that they hadn't murdered people in the making of the movie.
Well, we would get, both Cannibal Apocalypse and Cannibal Holocaust in 1980.
And Eaten Alive that year also. And after that, though, it made it difficult to continue with the cannibal stuff, but fortunately they'd have something else they could switch over to, because around this same time in 1978, George Romero had decided he finally wanted to do a sequel to Night of the Living Dead. Unfortunately, he was having some trouble getting funding for it, and Dario Argento ended up helping him out with that, and so you ended up with 1978 in Italy, the movie released with a cut done by Dario Argento called Zombie, and then released in the following year in the USA with the Romero cut, Dawn of the Dead, which I think we both sang our praises about in our last episode.
With Dawn of the Dead, you would have the major film debut of Tom Savini, who would, especially in the following decade, go on to become a legendary special effects artist, particularly in the horror genre. In 1979, we would get Phantasm from Don Coscarelli. We would get... What?
Nothing. I have to laugh when I think of Phantasm, just because the first one, it's funny, but it's mostly a really good horror movie, but just that series just gets so ridiculous as it goes on.
So with the release of Phantasm, we now have at this point two really iconic horror villains. We're going to have the Tall Man and Michael Myers of Halloween. We would also get Alien, which for a horror film, an awful lot of the film is focused on isolation, and I think that really works to the advantage. We would also get the Amityville Horror, which is going to kind of kick off this supernatural craze again, this kind of haunted house film, and as you know, Amityville Horror is going to spawn more sequels than any non-slasher franchise needs. We would also get the first sequel to Dawn of the Dead, by Lucio Fulci, is going to be Zombie 2.
Yeah, really showing that where that cannibal craze in Italian cinema was replaced by the zombie craze.
And we're going to see some really cringy kills in his films that follow. The eyeball onto the splintered wood in Zombie 2 is, even now.
Don't forget the shark versus zombie fight.
Oh, yeah, that was spectacular.
Yeah, and of course, John Carpenter's Halloween really just brought a whole bunch of things in the horror genre together. I know John Carpenter composed the music, but he said it was inspired a lot by the music in Dario Argento's Suspiria and The Exorcist. Clearly it borrowed a lot from like 1974's Black Christmas, which was based off the urban legends about the Babysitter, which is what the financiers for Halloween had originally pitched to John Carpenter. And it has things like Lila Loomis from Psycho referenced in it, with Dr. Loomis pursuing Michael Myers. And of course that movie's really going to become the poster for what you imitate with most future slashers. With that and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, of course.
And that's really going to lead us into the 1980s, which is where we're going to see the explosion of the VHS, which is going to make horror films, all films in general, but particularly horror films, is going to make them much more accessible. You're going to see an era where, because of home video, you're going to see horror movies pumped out as fast as possible, one after another. You're going to see every horror movie is going to try to become a franchise. You're going to have some films are going to have 2 sequels in a year, within a calendar year of each other.
Yeah, and a lot of the around this time, since VHS was really becoming a big thing, most major film distributors were trying to avoid it at this time because they were worried that if they put their movies on cassette, then they would be pirated and they'd lose their grip on the market. So because of this, the VHS market was really ruled by the low budget. And I know, like in the UK, this caused them to start referring to a lot of these as video nasties, to refer to the violent, low-budget direct-to-video horror movies. And in the 70s, the mature rating had been replaced by PG to give better clarity on what it was supposed to mean. In 1984 in the UK, they were passing new laws requiring that all videos be classified. Any earlier videos had 3 years to reclassify, and some didn't. So this caused some films like The Exorcist to become banned, which caused a whole bunch of popular cultural backlash. And around this same time in the US, you have films that are blending horror elements into other genres, like Gremlins and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and that's what caused them to finally make the PG-13 as a middle ground between PG and R at this time. Although, of course, nowadays, PG-13 pretty much just means the same as M did back before that.
The 80s would also give us almost a renaissance of comedy horror. 3 decades ago, we had movies like Abbott and Costello Meet the Wolfman. It became almost a trope in its time. But the 80s would see a resurgence of the comedy horror film. It was played much less for comedy, but it was okay to kind of interject these comedic situations into an otherwise straight horror film.
Yeah, I know Peter Jackson got started around this time with his splatter horror comedies like Bad Taste in 87 and a little later, but Brain Dead in 92.
Just like the 70s, the 80s are going to explode with, right off the bat, we get Cannibal Apocalypse, Cannibal Holocaust. 1981, we're going to get City of the Living Dead, a.k.a. The Gates of Hell. We're going to have The Fog from John Carpenter. Our first Friday the 13th film, one of my personal favorite franchises. We'll get Prom Night, which is not only going to cement Jamie Lee Curtis as a fixture in horror, it's going to give birth to the Scream Queen. We're going to have the Stephen King adaptation, The Shining, which is now heralded as one of the most spectacular suspense horror films of all time. We'll see Sam Raimi's Evil Dead. We will get The Howling. We will also see sequels to both Friday the 13th and Halloween, which will also give birth to Jason Voorhees, the greatest slasher killer of all time.
Yeah, you had a whole lot of these following the success of Halloween. You had a whole bunch of these slasher killer madmen films in the early 80s, like Friday the 13th and The Burning and Prom Night, like you said. And once it gets saturated enough with those, though, they start shifting in the later 80s into supernatural slashers, where you get stuff like 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street with Freddy Krueger, the best slasher of all time. 1988's Child's Play, where the killer is a possessed doll, and even in 86, Friday the 13th, Jason Lives, they convert him from a regular living killer into an undead.
1982 is going to be important for a couple of reasons. We're going to see one of the earliest examples of a remake with The Thing from John Carpenter. We're going to get Poltergeist with a horrible clown. We're going to see Creepshow, which is going to be a Stephen King and George Romero collaboration. We'll see a couple more of those over the years. We will get American Werewolf in London, which kind of sets off this new era of practical effects with Rick Baker. Wonderful practical effects in American Werewolf in London. And that's also going to be a good example of the comedy horror evolution and resurgence in the 80s. For the most part, American Werewolf in London is just a straight-up horror film, but there's enough dark comedy in it. 1983, we'd get Christine by John Carpenter, who I should mention is on a roll throughout the 80s. We're going to get One Dark Night. We're going to get a sequel to Psycho in 1983.
Yeah.
And this is going to be one of the first examples of a movie getting a sequel 20 years later.
Yeah, and there was a sequel to the book, but this has nothing to do with it.
No, this is a cash-in. We'll get Videodrome. This is also the year I was born, so, great year all around.
Same.
Yep. We will get the Thriller music video in 1983, which did a lot more for the music and music video industry than it did for horror. But you've got a Michael Jackson music video, who at the time was one of the most important musical artists. You've got Vincent Price on that track. You have John Landis, who is riding high from American Werewolf at this time. You've got Rick Baker, who did the practical effects for American Werewolf in London. You have Landis's wife, Deborah Noodleman, who had worked on Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they have a $900,000 budget for this music video, and that's $2.3 million adjusted for inflation.
Yeah, if you need a sign that the 80s is when horror really blew up, I think that's one of the biggest pop stars in the world with a multi-million-dollar budget just for a music video, and he makes it all about zombies and werewolves.
And as we move into 84, some of the films like you had mentioned, and this is when we really start to see the comedy horror blending. We get Gremlins by Joe Dante. We get Ghostbusters, which, while I would consider it more a comedy than a horror, there are definitely some horror aspects in there. I remember as a child the librarian ghost.
Mm-hmm.
Whew, that was creepy. We're going to get Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter. We see how that went. We will also get The Toxic Avenger from Troma. They'd been around since about 1974, but in 1984 they have their first really big.
You can do it.
They have their first really big mainstream success with The Toxic Avenger, and over the next 2 decades, and even till today, Troma's going to have an amazing presence in the horror genre, the trashy film genre. In 1985, we're going to get Day of the Dead, which is going to be the last Romero zombie film we see for 20 years. 1985 is going to give us 2 really divisive films in the horror community. We get Friday the 13th Part 5 and A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. Now, I enjoy both of these films. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 in the last few years the last decade has started to be seen in a new light. People are starting to appreciate it more and more. But for years, these were very divisive films within the horror community. We're going to get Reanimator, which is going to be our first Gordon, Yuzna, Crampton, and Combs collaboration. We'll see a lot more of that little group over the years. We're going to get Return of the Living Dead, which is going to kind of turn the zombie film on its head. They can run, they can talk,
They can sing.
They can give some pretty funny lines. They're not relegated to the recently deceased anymore. They're burrowing up out of the grounds. And we will also have Fright Night, which in my opinion is one of the best comedy horror films. In 1986, we're going to see a sequel to Alien. We're going to get Critters. We'll get Killer Party.
Amazing movie.
And it is. It really is. And we will get Maximum Overdrive, Stephen King's directorial debut. And by his own words, he was coked out of his mind the entire time he was working on the film, and it shows, but I love that movie. 1987, we're going to get The Lost Boys, which is one of my personal favorites. We will get Predator, and this is important because Alien and Predator as a franchise have a storied history. We will get Clive Barker's Hellraiser, which is notable not only for being iconic as a horror film. We're going to have an author that is going to basically, for the first time, be given complete directorial control over a film. He had no directorial experience, and they let him helm this film, and it works a lot to the favor. 1988, we will get Halloween 4, which will return Michael Myers to the series after Halloween 3 was largely dismissed at the time because people were expecting Michael Myers. We'll get Killer Clowns from Outer Space, Pumpkinhead, Waxworks, which is one of your favorites, correct?
Correct.
You've always talked that film up to me. It's a good film, though.
It's still my fave.
We will get Maniac Cop, which we spoke about recently, and Pen. Pen is not a movie I see talked about a lot, but once you experience it, there's no going back. 1989, we'll get Leviathan, which is going to be one of the more well-known Alien knockoffs. We'll get Puppet Master, which will set off an entirely new craze in horror films.
Did it, or is it a follow-up from Child's Play? They're about the same time, so.
Yeah, and then after Puppet Master, we'll get stuff like Dolls and all that. We will jump into the 90s. Do you have anything else about the 80s?
I lament that I don't have anything meaningful to say about The Gate or Intruder.
Then we'll head into the 1990s. You're going to see some major things in the 1990s. The big three are all going to be killed off and immediately brought back.
Yeah, I think you'll see it some still in like the late 90s, but obviously it's really obvious in like the late 80s that horror is crossing over with comedy more and more, and you're hitting the end of that horror cycle with the slashers, and everything's becoming comedic. Everyone likes Jason and Freddy Krueger now. They're not scary anymore. So that's sort of in the 90s is going to have a reversion back again to more realistic horror.
Well, and that goes along too with the 90s. You're going to see the genre evolve away from that as we go through the 90s, and it's going to become more about a slick presentation and kind of these major tonal changes, especially in franchises. We're going to see the technology boom, which for better or worse inspires a lot of horror movies in the 90s.
Yeah, at least we're past the point in the 80s where they're having all the demon-possessed computers and fitness gyms that have ghosts in the machines.
Yeah, they just get replaced with movies like Arcade and Evolver. We're also going to see a lot of franchises during this time that are going to find an audience in the initial film, and then they're going to cut out the middleman and go straight to video for the rest of the sequels. We'll also get a boom of miniseries in the 90s as well. Speaking to the miniseries, 1990 will give us probably one of the most popular TV miniseries ever with Stephen King's It. Amazing performance from Tim Curry would give millions of children nightmares for the next 20 years. 91, we reach the beginning of killing off the big three. We have Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. We would start to see a resurgence here in the suspenseful horror movie with Silence of the Lambs. We would get Puppet Master 3, which would take the puppets from being villains to being anti-heroes. 92, we would be introduced to Candyman. We would get Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is going to set off its own little mini resurrection of the gothic horror film. Army of Darkness from Sam Raimi.
Big rise in vampires in the 90s.
Oh, definitely. 1993, we would see the second film in the Kill Off franchises with Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. Probably the single most divisive film in the franchise, probably more so than Part 5. There's some really weird stuff in that movie that a lot of people don't like. We would get Leprechaun. That will be a franchise that fully embraces comedy horror, but it will set off its own franchise. In 1994, we would see Cemetery Man. We would get a follow-up of sorts from Bram Stoker's Dracula with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We would get In the Mouth of Madness, which would prove to be what I consider one of John Carpenter's best films. He's kind of really starting to pull away from the slasher.
Yeah, you sort of get a rise in the more Lovecraftian films again with some stuff like that and Event Horizon.
And only 3 years away from killing him off, we get Wes Craven's The New Nightmare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's sort of a big point showing the move back to the more realistic horror. Obviously, Wes Craven's New Nightmare is fantastical, but they have it set in the real world, and that really sort of sets the stage for what Wes Craven would do next with like a Scream in 1996, which just at this point they're just doing a complete postmodern deconstruction of the genre in Scream. Although, ironically, Scream itself would then cause another wave of the more down-to-earth horror movies with things like I Don't Know What You Did Last Summer in 97, Urban Legend in 98.
New Nightmare is also, from my memory, it's one of the first really meta horror films. 95, the big three are killed off now with The Curse of Michael Myers. 1996, we get one of the first in space movies with Hellraiser Bloodline. We get
finally
we get The Craft, which is gonna kick off another. We've had the slashers at this point, but now we're gonna really start to focus on characterization in the teen horror film.
Well, you kind of get a revival also of a very small revival of the sort of occult horror phase.
Oh yeah, definitely. And like you said, with Scream, horror kind of gets side-eyed with Scream. Really delves into all the tropes that have been established directly in the movie. 1997, we've already got a sequel to Scream. The franchise is already starting to become what it was examining. We get Wishmaster, which is one of the first really big examples of a movie finding an audience, and then the rest of the films go straight to video, much later DVD. 1998, we get Bride of Chucky. Chucky was never killed off with the other big three in a quasi-supposedly permanent method, but he had kind of went out of the public eye for a while.
Well, this is also there was some comedy elements in 3, but Bride of Chucky is the point where his franchise finishes turning completely into comedy horror.
We get Halloween H2O in 98, which is its own timeline, so technically they didn't bring Michael Myers back immediately, but they did. We get The Faculty in 98, which is a great throwback to like the 80s teen films, things like Monster Squad and Lost Boys. And then in 1999, we get The Blair Witch Project, which is going to kick off the found footage craze, viral marketing campaigns. We get remakes of The Haunting and The House on Haunted Hill. And we get The Sixth Sense, which is going to kick off the With a Twist trope. It's going to start with The Sixth Sense. There's been other films that's done it before, but we're going to start to see that a lot more in the following decade.
After that thorough deconstruction that happened with the 90s of the horror genre and the reimaginings of it, at this point I think the genre was starting to get a bit burnout and starting to move back out of the mainstream again. And this is when you start getting like the complete and total parodies of it with stuff like a 2000s Scary Movie, which is nothing but just a complete mockery of horror tropes.
Especially the more recent ones, which is funny because a lot of the more recent horror films were much more straight-laced than what we had had, and they were kind of examining the tropes and trying to play with expectations.
Now, the problem is you can only do that so much before you're done, and then you have to come up with something new.
Yeah, you've just become exactly what you're trying to tear apart.
Otherwise, you have to go the comedic route and become a Scary Movie or Leprechaun in the Hood.
Well, in the 2000s, we're also going to see the reboot's going to come to life in a big way. We're going to get bad CGI, direct-to-video, direct-to-DVD. It's during this period I began to learn that if you could look at the cover of a film that went straight to VHS/DVD and then flip it over, you could compare the screenshots from the film to the CGI on the cover, and it gave you a very good indicator of whether you wanted to take that movie home or not. We're going to see the birth of the mockbuster here. DVD is going to create the first really easy access to deleted scenes, alternate endings, bonus content. We're going to see an explosion of J-horror remakes. Torture porn is going to be reborn here. We're also going to see an explosion of zombies during this time. We're going to see zombie movies everywhere.
Yeah, but both of those kind of happen simultaneously. I haven't seen much of it, but I know I've read stuff about the torture porn resurgence actually happening in France with what was called French New Extremity. That occupied the first couple years of the aughts until it finally made its way into the U.S. with things like Saw in 2004, Eli Roth's Hostel, and The Devil's Rejects in 2005. And meanwhile, you had that zombie revival, which I think probably properly kicked off with 2002's 28 Days Later.
Oh, yes, and we all know how I feel about 28 Days Later. That is probably my favorite horror movie of all time. You get way too much than any person deserves from that film. You get great music, you get great aesthetics, you get some really surreal imagery and scenery, and they're not zombies, but it's a zombie movie.
Yeah, and of course, following the success of that, you get stuff like into the following year, you get the Walking Dead comic, which would become the TV series in 2010. That's still going now on season 10. Or the World War Z novel in 2006. Still the comedy elements, though, and stuff like Shaun of the Dead.
2000 would also introduce us to Rob Zombie with House of a Thousand Corpses. And Rob Zombie is very hit or miss. Some people love him, some people can't stand him. I see very few people in the middle when it comes to Rob Zombie films. 2001, Jason would join NASA. I love Jason X. A lot of people hate it. I completely understand why you do, but I love it. 2001 would also give us Children of the Living Dead, the first movie to my knowledge that shows a jazz hands dancing zombie.
That's the true horror.
Yes, it is. 2002, we'd get Cabin Fever. We'd get Dog Soldiers, which we had not had a werewolf movie in a long time. Then we got Dog Soldiers, which has some amazing practical effects. Probably one of the last werewolf films we see that has practical effects. 2004 would also bring us the first two films in the J-horror remake craze. We'd get Ju-on the Grudge. We'd get The Ring.
Well, Ring was really, for Japan, a big restart in their horror scene, so it really kicked off a whole lot of other stuff coming over here, like, The Ring, Ju-on the Grudge, Dark Water.
One Missed Call, Pulse, Shudder.
Mm-hmm.
You have anything else on that?
No, not really. I guess I just felt like I had to acknowledge that Japanese horror was pretty dead before the stuff that started coming over here around then.
Yeah, and it's kind of crazy because by the time we got The Ring and Ju-on the Grudge, there were already 4 Ju-on movies and 3 Ring movies. They already had Ring. They had Ringu 2, and Ringu 0, and then we had the Ju-on 1, Ju-on 2, then Ju-on the Grudge, or The Grudge. In Japan, it was just called The Grudge, but 2003, we're going to finally get Freddy vs. Jason. I was on that hype train. I believe I saw it 5 times in theaters.
I think I was only with you for half of those.
Yeah. Probably the most important thing horror-wise that happens in 2003 is House of the Dead.
Is that important?
Because it introduced Uwe Boll to the world. We also get Hot Tension, which is going to play off of the J-horror invasion, if you will. Once again, we're going to start seeing a lot of foreign films come to the United States. 2004, they're kind of riding off of the Freddy vs. Jason. We get Aliens vs. Predator. We get a huge explosion in the zombie film scene with the Dawn of the Dead remake. 2005, after a 20-year hiatus, George Romero returns to the zombie film with Land of the Dead.
And then in 2007 you had Paranormal Activity, continuing that found footage craze from the Blair Witch Project, which you'd also see in stuff like Cloverfield.
We also get Rob Zombie's Halloween in 2007, which is going to take Michael Myers into a whole new direction. He's a slasher, but in Rob Zombie's Halloween, we see a very visceral brutality, a lot of overkill. It's going to be almost a throwback to like a grindhouse or an exposition film. It goes so far into the darkness of the story being told. 2008, following up on films like Hot Tension, we're going to get Let the Right One In, which is eventually going to get an inferior remake. We would get a musical torture porn movie in 2008, though, Adam. Repo!
What was that? Oh, that's true, yeah.
2008, we'd also get the first, to my knowledge, borderline torture porn musical with Repo, the Genetic Opera. 2009, we would see a Friday the 13th remake, and Sam Raimi would return in a big way with Drag Me to Hell. And that brings us to the end of the 2000s.
Yeah, and at this point, I think we've been running long enough. We should probably stop here. The 2010s are probably a bit too recent for us to really qualify the trends of the decade. That might be something fun to do in the near future, though.
In anything that recent, we'd have to do something much more nuanced, in my opinion, for it to be relevant.
Yeah, I would say probably most relevant is that really, while it started in the 2000s, once you get to the 2010s is really where the internet age is changing the horror landscape and everything's switching over to streaming services.
Not that there's anything wrong with streaming services. They give some quality entertainment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, also the big thing really for the internet age is how that has allowed like a distribution to be so much freer than it was before. So it's never been a better time to be an indie film creator. But of course, that's still too fresh that we'll just have to wait and see where the new internet age and the breakdown of the more controlled distribution of film and horror, where that takes the genre going into the future.
Works for me.
Thank you for listening to Here's the Horror. You can subscribe and review Here's the Horror wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. You can also help make the world a little bit more horrifying by subscribing to us on Patreon, where you can gain access to bonus content and directly support the podcast.
You can also follow us on Twitter at Here Is the Horror, and join and like us on Facebook at facebook.com Here Is the Horror for additional content and to help support us.
You can always find us at here'sthehorror.com, where you can find all of our episodes, show notes, and more. And you can email any questions, comments, or suggestions to us at here'sthehorror@gmail.com. The opening song is Nightmare Machine by Kevin MacLeod. The interstitial songs are Supernatural Radio by Kevin MacLeod, The Visitor by Shane Ivers, and Engulfed by the Night by Darren Curtis. The closing song is Dealing with the Devil by Darren Curtis.
Next time, we're going to be talking about a personal favorite of mine and Adam's, Silent Hill. So, until next time, remember, if you die, you only have to wait 3 or 4 years till your popularity merits a remake, a reboot, or a return to form.
But until then, stay horrified. Hadn't really thought about where I was going to go from there. Never mind, we'll just cut that. I need to stop saying of course.
See, I'm trying to watch the uhs and the ums.
Do we really need every Friday the 13th movie mentioned?
I didn't mention 3.